Hi. I hope you can still hear after the previous incident. Thanks so much for Patrizia for the introduction and for the organizers, Oakwe, Atre, and everybody for being here. I feel that the things I've been struggling over for the past few years somehow are about to find a home or are finding a home, which is very encouraging when you write about people that you can't even Google. So there it goes. You asked for politics. On February 25, 1956, Nikita Khrushchev delivered his famous secret speech in a closed session of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Criticizing the personality cult of Stalin, the speech touched upon many dark aspects of Stalin's reign, such as the mass persecutions and the show trials. Deeming them foreign to the spirit of Marxism-Leninism, Khrushchev called for a change of direction in the Soviet Union, away from Stalin's excesses and aberrations, and back to the path initially laid out by Lenin. The secret speech didn't remain secret for too long. Soon thereafter, it circulated throughout the Soviet Union satellite states, and that's how it kind of leaked in some ways, thus unleashing the suppressed critiques of Stalinism and spurring on the spread of reform communism. The latter's aim was not to overthrow the existing political system, but to analyze it critically from within, using the basic precepts of Marxism, and to improve it, and potentially bring forth a communism with a human face, which is the kind of a motto of an entire era and connects to topics and issues of humanism that have been brought up in different socio-political contexts. As the etymology of term reform implies, this process is closely related to aesthetics, suggesting the altering of pre-existing forms to create new, yet related ones. Indeed, around 1956, the Soviet Union and its satellite states began to move away from Stalinist aesthetics, gradually abandoning ornate, eclecticist architecture and tempering, or even rejecting, socialist realist painting and sculpture. The tempering model is the one that Boris Groys mentioned. The rejecting I might show you a little bit soon. Towards the end of the 1950s, a new aesthetic model of socialist modernism emerged in the Eastern Bloc, which did not go unnoticed on the other side of the Iron Curtain. In 1958, an article in the Journal American Architectural Record entitled "Soviet Architecture, Does It Have a New Look?" surveyed the latest Soviet architectural press and discovered new projects that embraced streamlined modernist forms in glass and steel that were strikingly different from what most Westerners expected to see, that is, Stalinist historicism. And you see here some of the new projects coming out of architecture schools or architectural journals, and the things that everybody had in mind as the Stalinist look. This new look was intimately connected to the greater reformist culture of de-Stalinization. Yet this change in official aesthetics would not be seen simply as a consequence of political reform. It was, as I will argue, part and parcel of it. And in fact, some of the first signs of the impending thaw were first made manifest in the realm of aesthetics. Already in 1954, so 2 years before the secret speech, Khrushchev delivered another, less known speech at the All-Union Conference of Builders, Architects, and Workers in the Building Industry. Big titles are endemic to the region. In the speech of the emergent Soviet leader, and offered a scathing critique of the architects of Stalinism, condemning them as frivolous and irresponsible, yet all the while refraining from any accusations towards Stalin himself, who had died a year before, who was still mentioned in positive terms. By supporting standardized design, there goes the phone again, and new materials and techniques, such as prefabrication and reinforced concrete, Khrushchev presented himself as a technocratic, rational engineer who would replace Stalin's irrational demiurge, which is a term that Boris Groys very often brings up. Khrushchev's main target was the excessive ornamentation of the high Stalinist style, and I quote, "Certain architects have been carried away with putting spires on buildings, with the result that such buildings resemble churches." Oh, sorry, I should have put this picture. Again, Khrushchev, sorry. A little bit more Khrushchev. They put spires on buildings with the result that such buildings resemble churches. Do you like the silhouette of a church? I do not wish to argue about tastes, but in apartment houses, such appearance is not necessary. The architect needs beautiful silhouettes, but the people need apartments to live, unquote. The call for functionalism was accompanied by an unexpected reference to the history of Soviet architecture. Quote, some architects try to justify their incorrect stand on waste in designs by referring to the need to combat constructivism. But they waste state funds under the guise of fighting constructivism. What is constructivism? Here's how the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, for instance, defines this tendency. Constructivism substitutes barren technical aspects born of the construction design for artistic design. Demanding functional logic and rationalism in construction, the constructivists actually reached aesthetic admiration of form unrelated to content. The consequence of this is the anti-artistic, dull, box style characteristic of modern bourgeois architecture. Constructivism was sharply criticized in many party directives and decrees, unquote. Finally, Khrushchev concluded, quote, some architects declaiming about the need to combat constructivism go to the opposite extreme. They decorate buildings' facades excessively and often unnecessarily, thus wasting state funds. Such architects should be called constructivists in reverse, since they themselves are lapsing into, quote, aesthetic admiration of form divorced from content, unquote. How many political leaders you can hear today talking about form and content? Anyway, this speech is typical of the reformist ethos that would characterize the upcoming thaw. While it marked a clear change of direction away from historicism and ornamentation and towards a fiscally responsible functionalism, it also held fast to certain orthodoxies, such as the wholesale condemnation of constructivism and the affirmation of architecture's social function. While it paves the way for the unadorned glass boxes of modernism that will soon appear, it also condemns them as anti-artistic and bourgeois. In the process, the meaning of terms such as constructivism and rationalism were utterly twisted in a rhetorical balancing act that is typical of official Soviet discourse, especially in periods of crisis and transition, such as the one following Stalin's death. This new direction in Soviet architecture became concrete with the official decree issued on November 9, 1955 by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Council of Ministers, entitled, quote, on the elimination of excesses in design and construction. And here you see actually a building that was caught in the middle of this, this decree. So half of it was ornamented, the other one was left naked, as it were. While abolishing ornamentation and calling for changes in Soviet architectural culture, the decree did not address the core problem, that is, the aesthetic theory of socialist realism. The architects were still expected to produce works that were socialist in form and national in content, as the old motto goes, obeying to the imperative for realism, emphasizing national culture, avoiding personal themes, adhering to the party line, and avoiding political neutrality. The Russian terms for each of these things that I'm sparing you from. Under Stalinism, such signifying functions were fulfilled by the integration of reliefs, frescoes, mosaics, freestanding sculptures, and other decorative detailing into architecture, constituting a veritable Gesamtkunstwerk that blurred the boundaries between the traditional artistic mediums. Here's the kind of magnum opus of Stalinism. If you ever go to Moscow, that's one of the things to visit. And here's a little detail from the Uzbekistan pavilion. There's a very long story about this, but I don't think I have time. You can ask me later. So, when Khrushchev condemned this paradigm as excessive, in a manner that, interestingly enough, prefigures his condemnation of Stalin's own political excesses soon thereafter, so there's the kind of parallel between ornamental excess and political excess at this time, artists and architects were confronted with a difficult task of reform. They had to dismantle the Stalinist total work without jettisoning its signifying functions, or the political efficacy of combining different mediums into a cohesive whole. Khrushchev's characterization of modern box architecture as dull and anti-artistic implies an expectation for buildings to have artistic value, despite contradicting prescriptions for a no-frills standardized construction. At the time, artists and architects attempted to overcome this impasse by striving for a synthesis of the arts, a synthesis Kunst, it's called in Russian and many other languages, a rather vague term that usually referred to the integration of works of painting and sculpture into architecture. During the 1950s, the synthesis of the art was particularly popular on both sides of the Iron Curtain, omnipresent in communist Europe, but also ardently promoted in the West by figures such as Le Corbusier. André Bloch was the author of Architecture d'aujourd'hui, the editor of Architecture d'aujourd'hui, and Paul Damas, who was also active in the States. Here I should mention that throughout the conference there's been little glimpses of the synthesis of the art popping in different slides, which I will now list, just to show you that it's one of these weird things that everybody talked about in the 50s and 60s, and then the very term became so terrible that nobody wanted to talk about. A little bit like humanism, I guess. So we've seen examples, of course, the Chinese murals, the Aula Magna in Caracas, in the Calder in the Villanueva building, and the whole Ciudad Universitaria in Caracas is seen as the ultimate example of synthesis for everybody. In Yugoslavia, it was published everywhere and loved by everybody. We saw the monument in Baghdad from Nada's talk in 1959. We saw the discussions on synthesis of the arts in the journals that Federico talked about in Argentina. We saw the Turkish pavilion in the Expo, which was the ultimate example of this in some ways, and pretty much everything in Patrick Flores's presentation on the Philippines was also about the integration of art into kind of modern architecture. So there's a kind of across-the-board agony to put art and architecture together. And maybe you have more examples from your areas of interest. So the term's popularity, the synthesis of the arts that is, should be attributed, I think, to its vagueness. In the East, it could refer to anything from Lenin's classicist 1918 plan for monumental propaganda, which was to plop monuments of the heroes of the revolution everywhere, to Stalinist icons such as the Moscow Metro and the 1937 pavilion, Soviet pavilion in Paris, to the socialist modernism architecture and design of the Thaw, which is about to come. Transcending more transient aesthetic categories such as style, the synthesis of the arts was a way of dealing with the problem of art's role in a socialist society, a constant concern since the October Revolution. The integration of works of art into modernist architecture was thus a way to prevent the latter, architecture, from being dull and dehumanized, and to preserve its signifying and therefore revolutionary functions, which were menaced by standardization. Already in March 1954, a year after Stalin's death and a few months before Khrushchev's speech against ornamentation, a three-day symposium on the synthesis of the arts took place in Moscow, co-organized by the Union of Soviet Architects and the Union of Soviet Artists. The conference took place shortly after the completion of many iconic works of Stalinist architecture, such as the Circle-Line stations of the Moscow Metro, the reopened Old Union Agricultural Exhibition, which you see here, the Volga-Don Canal, and others. While many of the architects, artists, and art historians praise these works as prime examples of the integration of art into architecture, there was also criticism. Some lamented the, I quote, dictatorial role of architects, who thought of the artists' roles as secondary and told them what to do, essentially. They never truly collaborated with them, which was a big issue, but rather only invited them to decorate the buildings after they were erected. Others criticized the overuse of sculpture as a bourgeois tendency that reduced statues and reliefs to mere repetitive ornaments. Most agreed that the Moscow State University, which you see here, completed in 1953 and designed by Lev Rudnev, was guilty on both counts and should serve as an example of what to avoid in future attempts to integrate art and architecture. So even if it has such things which are, more than life-size, that you can't see them. They're little flecks of ornament, and in fact, they're works of art, right? So there's a tension between what is a work, what is an ornament, and all these wonderful things. On the other hand, everybody agreed at this moment that the most shining example of the synthesis of the arts was indeed the Soviet pavilion of the Paris World Fair of 1937, designed by Boris Yofan and topped by a colossal sculpture by Vera Muchina, which depicted a male worker and a female farmer at a collective farm, usually known by the Russian names as Рабочий и колхозница. The symposium participants praised its monumental force, the equal weight given to both architecture and sculpture, as well as what they imagined was a harmonious, egalitarian collaboration between Joffan and Muchina. Kind of like the figures themselves, right? Building communism together. This assessment, often repeated in books and articles in the first years after Stalin's death, was itself another manifestation of reform, I think, judging pre-war Stalinist architecture as post-war Stalinist architecture, sorry, as too hierarchical and excessive, not unlike Stalin himself. Artists, architects, and theorists drew attention to a time before this deviation. While the political reforms were inspired by Lenin, the aesthetic reforms looked back to the socialist realism of the 1930s, never really venturing into the experimental avant-garde 1920s, and here I kind of disagree with Boris Groys, whom I admire in all sorts of levels, which would have risked turning the aesthetic reform of the 1950s into an aesthetic revolution. So if you take it too far, if you go back to Tatlin or something, you might risk destroying the whole thing. These processes culminated in 1956, when an architectural competition was held for the Soviet pavilion of the upcoming World Fair of 1958 in Brussels, which we heard about yesterday. This was the first World Fair of the Cold War, providing an opportunity for the Soviet Union to present itself as a triumphant, technologically advanced superpower, already leading the new space race with the imminent launch of the first Sputniks. In addition, this would also be one of the first manifestations of the new, post-Stalinist Soviet architecture to be shown to the whole world. The architectural teams that submitted designs had to follow the imperatives for light and efficient construction. 3? What? Okay, sorry. Okay, so the light and efficient constructions, which were not only imposed by the aforementioned 55 decree, but also stipulated by the Belgian organizers. But at the same time, they had to provide a kind of clear ideological message. So here I'm going to get out of the text since we don't have time. So you see these are some of the projects that are now in the Museum of Architecture in Moscow. They're beautiful, huge drawings. And you see how they combine a kind of classicist, a kind of pantheon, but made in glass, with a flattened Vera Muchina, the same sculpture on the facade. Here you see they get inspired from the 1939 pavilion in Moscow, which was also huge, in New York, which was also a huge success. So they put a kind of international style building, clad in stone, with the central mast and the reliefs that were also present in Muchina, in stone, right? This is fantastic. I mean, you know, in the kind of, for somebody spending 4 years looking at these things, it's fantastic. So this is a kind of railway shed almost that has the exact same sculptural elements in front of one of the icons of modernity, which is the kind of glass Galerie des Machines almost, right? And this is the winning, this is another one, which, this is not the winning, sorry, which is utterly dematerialized cube, right? But then all the art and all the sculpture and all of these things slapped onto the glass, which even structurally it's extremely precarious. And this is the winning model, which you see is the most tame. I think it was also chosen because it was the cheapest one. It seemed like it. And then this is how it was realized in Brussels. That you see it's a kind of entirely prefabricated, shipped from Moscow, with very little ornamentation outside. So this brought me a little further, which is good. The necessary synthesis of the arts that had to happen, okay, because of all these reasons, took place in the interior, where the colossal statue of Lenin dominated the sky-lit central nave in an arrangement that recalled the position of the golden ivory statue of Athena within the Parthenon. I wish I was giving this lecture yesterday in that setting. This arrangement reflected the renewed focus on Lenin and his thought as a way of returning to the pure roots of communism, those that preceded the Stalinist heresy. Lenin's usual determined gaze does not point to some abstract future, but instead looks at the Sputnik, right? So the kind of abstract utopian thinking of Lenin leads to concrete results, the first man-made satellite. And near the entrance of the pavilion, you see here we have the same two people, the Рабочий and the Kolkhoznica, which are now separated, And instead of being agitprop, they're put on podiums. So they're kind of bourgeois exhibits in a kind of really tricky way. And the Muchina sculpture is reproduced in the catalog for the new, so they cannot really get over this kind of art. But you see them there. They really are art exhibits now. They're not synthesis of the arts. It's almost like a museum installation. So I really want to get to the other part, which is Poland. At this point, it is useful to compare the situation. No, it's tiny. The Poland is not. Don't worry. The situation in Poland, one of the Soviet satellites in Europe with a similar watershed moment took place in 1956. As the largest Soviet satellite in Europe with a relatively little pre-war communist activity, Poland experienced a brief yet thorough Stalinization in both aesthetics and politics in 48 to 53, followed by a swift de-Stalinization. A key moment in the reformism was the so-called Polish October of 1956, a bloodless transition into an open form of government that paved the way for the bloody Hungarian Revolution. I think Eva is going to talk about this. And this is a moment when we have a new versions of Marxist critiques of the Soviet Union, which are really interesting and really not well known. Marxism, humanism as an existentialism in Marxism, and all these things that are really happening and are not even translated today. This was, so I'll show you because I'm in the end of my line here. So there is the conference happening again. Here are the architects, but they're all de-Stalinizing themselves. They all said that what we've been doing was terrible, and we need to really go to modernism very quickly. And this is what's being built. And this is where they're holding the conference. So there's a kind of absurd moment, right, in this. And here I'm showing you, I don't need to talk about it really, but you see even the visual language of the journals, how art and architectural journals, this is 53. This is 55. Leger is a communist and figurative, so he's good. Architecture. And look at this, which is actually 57. It's extremely early for this kind of visual language, even for Britain or, you know. And you go here all the way, this is 59 and 60. So it happens very quickly, just as and one of the things I want to talk about is this. I'll just go through the pictures now. So you see here, this is what the Poles proposed for the Expo of 58. It was never built because it was too crazy. And here you see, I'll show you a little bit. So they wanted to cover the plot with a glass roof. There would be no walls except for one. They would keep all the trees underneath, as you see here, the glass roof. And there would just be one wall that you see here on a diagonal that would be undulating. And this is the picture that I showed you, this undulating wall that would be decorated with this kind of prehistoric, you know, generally human iconography on one side and abstraction on the other. And nothing else except for 4 curved screens that would present experimental films and electronic music and nothing else. Okay, no industry, no nothing. It would be an entirely dematerialized, kind of almost an installation, which is what how do we get to like new forms of art production through this really creepy discourse of synthesis of the arts is the greater project that I'm engaged in. So I just want to read. I mean, okay, I'll spare you from this. I might. But the synthesis of the arts becomes a kind of hub for radical practice in a place like Poland that kind of quickly vanishes, but it has, I think, survival in contemporary Polish art in many ways that I can tell you about later. But in the Soviet Union, it becomes a kind of officially mandated thing. And this is, there are thousands of examples everywhere. When you walk around Moscow, this is all that you see. This is synthesis. So I had a really cute conclusion, but I think I should leave.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for stopping with Poland. So I have a very good introduction now. I don't know if it was planned, but it fits very much to my start. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's very nice to come to Munich and don't feel like to be in Germany because it's so international and so. So thank you for that to Atelier and Mr. Endwieser to make this possible. And a short side remark, I am not based at Tübingen, I'm based at European University Viadrina, now on the Polish-German border, an hour east from Berlin, which fits quite to my topic. I will start with an example from the contemporary. Political systems and art can be seen to be connected, but it's worth reiterating that political borders and confrontations can also be without direct consequences for the art world and its networks. I would like to start with an example given by Pamela M. Lee from the discourse about the so-called global contemporary 2 months ago on a conference in Amsterdam. Lee charts the strange transformation and afterlife of the dynamic between art and politics in reference to the concept of a global art world, which has by now frequently been defined as the global contemporary, whilst critically assessing the various assumptions that are made about the global art world. She asks herself, what has a global contemporary, referring to the visual arts after 1889, done with legacies such as post-communist, other than to naively imagine that they have been wiped away? She then asks, what is the role of the cultural economy in global art networks? In order to address her question, Lee discussed in detail the case of the North Korean Mansudae art studio in Pyeongchang in North Korea. According to Lee, the enterprise, Mansudae Art, is emblematic of the global contemporary as it's both as a transnational player in the market and a signatory of inverted cosmopolitanism. Mansudae is the biggest producer of bronze sculptures worldwide, acts as a full-service provider, even offering the conceptualization of artworks from scratch, and as a state company employs 4,000 people, including about 1,000 artists. I choose Mansudae as an example, not because it was founded in 1959, inside the time frame I defined for this lecture, but because North Korea is politically and economically probably the most isolated country of the world today, and in here of the Cold War, with strong and real borders. Mansudae shows that art networks cannot automatically equalize with the political, geographically, and economical ones. We see here two examples. One is the monument of the African Renaissance movement, finished in 2010, and the other one, and I was very surprised when I found this, is a fountain, the fountain of the fairy tales in Frankfurt, Main, and it's just 200 meters away from the European Central Bank, so this connection to this North Korean company was very interesting. They did just the renovation of it, they didn't the concept, it's an old one, but somehow it shows how the interconnections are. But let's come to my paper, which is about the relation of Polish and German art in the 1950s and 60s, and it is part of a broader project where I research on the internationality of the art in the GDR. I focus on this very limited geographic area. Let's call it a microcosm, situated in Central Europe, directly on the front line of the Cold War, and consisting of countries of both dominating systems, the West and the East. In this area, we find the symbol of that time, the so-called Iron Curtain, that divided Germany from 1949 onwards, from 1961 to 1989, even doing so by means of a wall. It shows on a small scale the controversy about abstraction and realism and its political impact, which, as we have heard already over the last few days, constituted the main global concern in art from around the world at that time. I'll just explain this briefly on the map. It's very important to understand in the relation of Poland and Germany that this area, which are here marked on the right side, have been German before. And all the discussions after the Second World War are about this area and the eastern borderline of Poland, which is in between the Rosa and the striped area. So in the GDR, already in 1950, accept this border, and the GDR is part of a socialist brother state, but the West doesn't accept this border. In Western Germany, the relation to Poland is very different. Most important, sorry, I just lost the track. the non-acceptance of the border constituted the main reason why political relations between Western Germany and Poland were frozen. Not helpful at all was that Chancellor Adenauer in the year 1950 joined the Order of Teutonic Knight that was in Poland the symbol of an aggressive Germany that is always prepared to invade its eastern neighbor. On the other side, we see a Polish reaction that characterized the foreign politics of West Germany as a manner of Wild West. In Poland, during this time, we find a very interesting poster culture, not only in the 1950s, but only in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Here is written, Crusade against Poland. Finally, only 25 years after the end of Second World War, in the year 1970, a Polish embassy was established in Bonn, and West Germany accepted the border of Poland. So the time where I'm talking about, there's officially, on a diplomatic level, no contact between Poland and West Germany. But let's come to Poland. As in most other countries in Central Eastern Europe, under socialist influence in Poland, there was a short consolidation phase after the Second World War, where the local avant-garde styles from the 20s reappeared. In 1948-49, the first exhibition of modern art ought to have testified to the strength of the avant-garde. In Poland, there appeared for a short period a surreal tradition, which was followed by a discourse surrounding Polish traditions of constructivism. Also in 1949 in Poland, socialist realism was officially adopted as the only officially recognized form of art in the People's Republic of Poland. The years from 1949 to 1956 were the only years when Poland artists suffered restriction or were even prohibited to work. During the introduction of socialist realism, there was an ongoing discussion and protest against this, but until 1956, it really remained the official form. Just to illustrate how different the socialist GDR and Poland were, in the GDR, the term socialist realism was only officially abolished in the year 1988, 1 year before it all ended, and abstract art was only then officially permitted and exhibited. So it's a totally different story in East Germany and in Poland. Poland saw one crucial exhibition, however, this is constituted only one event amongst a number of others that had impact on the development of Polish art after the death of Stalin. In the year 1955, we see here a picture of a remake in 2008. The Polish exhibition Youth Against War and Fascism was held in the Armory in Warsaw. So-called brutal realism was offered as a new national form and as alternative to socialist realism. Most interesting that this alternative was given by artists as the initiators and later accepted by politics. The artist Lenica describes that 1955 was the first year that saw the traces of war, occupation and the Holocaust in Poland grappled with a public exhibition. The style of the art was modernist, but rather post-impressionist, partly remission of the Polish tradition of colorism, and was generally strongly influenced by expressionism. However, abstract and informal art was not included of the show. I will now briefly summarize the consequences of the artistic thaw in Poland, as I refer to the Polish art historian Piotr Piotrowski. This process of de-Stalinization of the exhibition we see here meant the end of the avant-garde and at the same time the triumph of modernism. This statement is based on following definition. The definition of avant-garde: art is framed by the context of reality involving various forms of the utopian, the critical and the breaking through of the limits of consciousness with the aim of a social revolution. And the definition of modernist art: in this context, this is a concept that tends to separate art from social and political life and motivates for the autonomy of art. This has long-term consequences for art in Poland, because the art which goes unofficial is modernist will be not political. It's like also against this combination of the official socialist realism to politics. So the artists will not, and which makes it very easy for the official censorship, because most of the official art is just not politic art, and this has long consequences until the 80s and even the 90s in Poland. Polish art is, after 1957, is received very well internationally. A first step is an exhibition in 1958. It's not the first step. The first step is always Paris. From Poland, the first step going to the west is always Paris. It's also not Germany. But in 1958, there is a big exhibition in Moscow, the International Arts Exhibition. And Poland is the only country from the socialist world. All the socialist world is invited. It's a huge exhibition which does not exhibit socialist realism. They have these works of postmodernism, but also only one abstract work of Adam Marczynski. And a lot of people come to see this in Moscow, and they draw a lot of international attention, which also brings then some of the Polish artists to New York. They before have been in Paris in about 1957. There is Tadeusz Kantor, one of the important figures, and here we see a picture from an exhibition in MoMA, which then in 1961. I choose this just to show that Poland is also present in the US, just the opposite of Moscow. But now come to the relation of Polish art in the GDR. The mentioned Arsenal exhibition is one of the first group exhibitions of Polish art that was also shown in East Germany, namely in Berlin and Leipzig. This is a very interesting constellation, as the politics of art in the GDR was much more restrictive than they were in Poland. And indeed, it provoked a great deal. Just some pictures from this exhibition, which, as we have seen all this concrete art and what is at that moment happening on a global outward, seems not so far away from realism, but there is an article about the guest book from this exhibition, and if you read this, it's for me it's quite astonishing that people are fighting about Polish art in Berlin at 1956. So they say these artworks are incomprehensible for a human being, and they shout to another like ox or idiot. So, but the end is what I don't understand. I just reject it. This is like the reaction of the public, the reaction from the press, and in the journal Bildende Kunst, which is the official art journal of the GDR, is much more positive. It's like it's this short period in between 56 and 58, 59, where the GDR is much more open, and they try some things. And these are projects initiated by artists or the editor of this journal, Bildende Kunst, Herbert Sandberg, which is also writing about the show. And he says the pro of the Polish art is that the young generation will again be artistically honest, saying no more than what is visible in an instant, no sooner as having an apprehension through the medium of the artwork, and the viewer will have climbed this new form and will be able to connect the new artistic insight invested with new ideas. The weakness of this exhibition in the critiques is that it's not Polish enough, that it's not enough national form inside, that it's too international, mixing styles from mainly from Europe and from France and from Germany. The official art in the GDR is at that time is more what we see here. So we only later, or in a lot of time, not at all, we have this moment what we just saw in the Soviet Union. On one hand, we saw an example of the Bitterfelder Weg, which was a project where artists did go into the companies. They worked together with the workers and made the artworks during that time. And the other is an example of a Brigadebild, which shows just the situation of workers. And also here, the artist was working together with this Brigade. This painter, Dutch, he was a student of Oskar Schlemmer, so even we find all these relations to the 20s. It's not so obvious at that time. There were discussions about alternatives in art. So these are two examples of 1957 and 56, because the only way out of not being, to be somehow modernist but not constructivist formalist seems to be the expressionism, and coming back to this. And there are several attempts to do it, but they are rejected totally by the official cultural politics, and these paintings, they will not appear on an official level. Just to mention very briefly, there is also an abstract art or a concrete art going on in the GDR. This is Hermann Glöckner, which is but they work during all the time, but they don't really get. There is one Glöckner exhibition in the GDR, which is only in '81, so much later. It's one place in Dresden, the Kupferstichkabinett, where this art is permitted. But anyway, this is a very important person and he has a lot of influence. This artist. Also, the GDR starts to get organizer of international exhibitions. They initiate a biennale in Rostock in 1965. Again, Polish artists is invited, and we see here also that we have examples of socialist realism. So Poland at that time, because they are also under pressure from the Soviet Union, decided internally that only 15% of the works exhibit are allowed to be abstract. Inside Poland, it might somehow work. I have to research more on that. What they exhibit in the West, not at all, but in the GDR it fits somehow. So most of the artworks which go to the GDR2 project like this are realist. On these exhibitions, the only abstract works are coming from partners which are not part of the Eastern Bloc, like from Sweden or from Finland. Now let's go to West Germany. We heard about the situation in West Germany from the documenta, from the first documenta. I'll talk about the second documenta. I just have 3 more minutes, and so I come directly to the Polish contribution. We also find here again Tadeusz Kantor and Jan Lewenstein. I don't have a picture of Adam Marczynski here, and it's interesting because these are the only artists which are coming from the Eastern Bloc. And the theory of these German organizers in 55 and 59 is really that free art cannot develop in the Eastern Bloc. And even in 1959, Werner Haftmann develops a world culture. He says it's a model. Abstraction will be the future world culture. And he integrates Poland only because there's abstract art, but all other art and all other art history is just excluded from this world culture. Yugoslavia is also present, but as we heard, Yugoslavia is a very special case. It's not really part of this political Eastern Bloc. And Polish art then the next time is visible in Western Germany. So we are now really in Essen, in the famous Folkwang Museum, where in 1962 is an exhibition about Polish art. There are 200 artworks coming from Poland. We see it was a small budget. It's a very small and not very nice catalog, but they managed to do it. And if you read the introduction of the catalog, you will find that there is just mentioned der soziale Realismus. So in German, we would always call it the sozialistischer Realismus. And in all this introduction, there is no word about that Poland is a socialist country. So if I would take this catalog, I wouldn't understand that this art exists in Poland in 1962. And we again have here Tadeusz Kantor, but also Lenika, Obroczowski, so a lot of abstract art, a lot of constructivist art, so very different than what was on display in the GDR. I wondered why I worked for some years in organizing exhibitions and mainly in asking for loans and organizing traveling exhibitions. And getting loans always needs the help of somehow of the diplomacy. And I also asked for loans in Poland, and it was also always very difficult. So for me, it's very interesting how this worked in a situation where countries do not have official relations and change artwork. So in this case, it's obvious that there is that this guy here, Bertolt Beitz, he's a manager of Krupp company, and he was in Poland during the occupation in the 1940s. That he made all the contacts in Poland because he was in the 1960s in Poland for business, and at the same time he's involved in the art scene in Essen, and he starts to make this possible, that art from Poland comes to Western Germany. Now I have a 0 here, and I will perhaps just end with a picture of Documenta 2. So this is not Polish art we see here, but this is great Fotonotizen from Hans Hake, found in 1981 in the archive in Documenta. So this is a 1959 Documenta. I have the impression, after talking so much about this international relations, and now if I go really into this very limited geographical area, it gets, at one point we get very strict about style. So the situation in Germany, they don't make any exceptions in the East and in the West in 1950. So even in the USSR, they start with modernism and in arts and architecture. And so they do not in GDR at that time. They do this later. First in architecture, in the arts, very late. It's more the unofficial art. And in the West, we have the same situation with abstract art. So also there is no. This starts only in the beginning of the 60s, but we have a very frontline situation, and I think this is also to be considered where in this post-war period where we put the focus on. So where is a front line, where is a periphery, where is a center, and in this moment I have the impression we have to consider that also in words of a more critical geography that only analyzes like the movements and the power and also the stakeholders who are behind it, because also for the movement of Polish art, the art market on the other hand is important. So the loans for Documenta 2 were all coming from private galleries in Paris, not coming from Poland. So there is beyond a whole structure going on, also beyond politics. So thank you very much.
I also join everybody before me thanking for being invited here for this very dense conference, the contents of which have been so rich we'll all need time to process everything we've heard so far. So I would like to outline what I think was the role of the New Left in shaping the narrative of modernism in the framework of the restoration of modernism after 1945. So in Europe, the post-war years saw tectonic shifts in the culture that widely resonated. The restoration of modernism that had been lost to Nazism, Stalinism, and World War II started immediately and with great momentum. For example, in Paris, the Salon des Réalités Nouvelles, we heard about yesterday, declared continuation of the pre-war Circular Carré group, that opened in 1946, immediately after the war, as one of the signals that the pieces of the broken culture of modernity were being picked up, and progressive art was brought back into public consciousness as the reclaimed mainstream art of Europe. Joaquin Torres Garcia, about whom we also heard last night, one of the original participants of the Circular Carré, assured that interwar European abstraction survived in South America by publishing the journal Círculo y Cuadrado in Montevideo, But constructivism and abstraction had plenty of other trajectories to reach Asia, North Africa, North and South America, and Australia by way of the huge migration during and after World War II. These iterations of modernism and the avant-garde have yet to be integrated into the broader narrative of modernism. So far, we have separate chapters of them only. I would like to trace the rediscovery of the Russian avant-garde and its gradual integration into the history of modernism, where everybody knows it has been rediscovered, but how did it happen? As the rediscovery of the Russian avant-garde was followed also by the retrieval of the modernist and avant-garde arts of East and Central Europe and the Balkans, a process that has been ongoing for a long time but not entirely completed ever since. Now, there were many strong reasons to bring the Russian avant-garde into the fore, from the post-war dreams of a unified East-West culture to the emergence of the New Left after 1956. So when the Iron Curtain descended in 1948, left-wing artists and thinkers in Western Europe were still hopeful that they could witness a new beginning of a united collective European culture. And they reached out for East Europeans, actually, as it happened mainly for Czech artists. For example, on behalf of the Cobrau group, you know, the Copenhagen, Brussels, Amsterdam group, Constant Anton Nieuwenhuis appeared to believe in the continued relevance of the avant-garde program. Forecasting parts of what became later the New Left's agenda, he wrote in 1948, I quote, "In the unprecedented cultural emptiness that has followed the war, a new freedom is about to be born, as a result of which the profession of artist will cease to be privileged. In the period of transition, artistic creation finds itself at war with the existing culture, while simultaneously announcing a future culture. Art has a revolutionary role to play." End quote. However, the East Europeans, now under Soviet rule, had already known that this was pure utopia. Czech artist Jindřich Chalupetsky saw the reverse of the picture at the exact same time when he wrote, I quote, "The world around us changed almost overnight. We have deadly, stupid, and interminable propaganda. In the present practice, lies, deception, and ruthlessness are promised, I presumed, to lead to truth, honesty, fraternity, and peace," end quote. A turning point in the Cold War period was marked by the Soviet Union, as it has already been said, crushing the Hungarian uprising in 1956. Now, this was a turning point because that brought ultimate disappointment to many Western Communist Party members, and a great number of them quit their party, about 10,000 only in Britain, seeking alternatives to both capitalism and Soviet-type communism, and inspiring the thinking and political outlook of a new generation. The concepts of Marxism, Bolshevism, socialism, alienation were reconsidered, and new strategies were being sought. It was this renewed political discourse, seeking a third way in the field of art also, that was instrumental in the field of art too, in directing attention to the rediscovery of the revolutionary Soviet-Russian avant-garde of the 1910s and the early 1920s. That art was forgotten, but it did surface in small gallery exhibitions in the late 1950s. Drawing on Western collections, these shows included artists of different pursuits and careers, emigre or otherwise, indiscriminately. That is, works by expressionists like Kandinsky, Yavlensky, Haim Sotin, and Chagall were exhibited alongside abstract paintings by Malevich, El Lisitsky, and Ivan Puny, and constructions of Naum Gabo, Anton Pevsner, and Archipenko, and lyrical abstract works by émigré Russian artists like Serge Polyakov, Georges Anyankov, Nikolas de Stael, Pavel Mansurov, and others. These were thrown together simply because they were all related one way or another, and at one time or another, with Russia or the Soviet Union. The fact that, quote, official Russia would not show this art, end quote, also weighed in. After a few gallery shows in London and Milan in the 50s, the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam's 1957 Malevich exhibition was a landmark event. While it traveled to the international museum circuit, art dealers such as Denise Renay and Jean Chauvelin in Paris pioneered to organize similar survey shows for international constructive art, as they called it, between about 1957 and 61. I cut the list, followed by somewhat later but with great intensity, the exhibitions of the Gmurzinska Gallery in Cologne. The efforts at the restoration of modernism and the New Left's political agenda were underway to merge. The first conceptually clear survey exhibition of the Russian avant-garde that focused on the art within Russia only, with special emphasis on the revolution, opened in London Grosvenor Gallery in 1962, titled 2 Decades of Experiment in Russian Art, 1902-22. It was accompanied, meaningfully, by Camilla Gray's groundbreaking book, The Great Experiment, Russian Art between 1863 and 1922. The show included works by the major representatives of the early 1920s, and Gray, originally a ballet dancer, had studied the West European collections and archives, but she could also visit Russia and could interview individuals who participated in or had witnessed the avant-garde movements there. As wife of Oleg Prokofiev, Russian composer Sergei Prokofiev's son, she was in the position to ferret out documents. This was the first time a Westerner inquired into modern Russian art and mediated it to Western readers and viewers. The publisher's endorsement on the back of Gray's book pointed out that, I quote, "This is the first book to examine the vitally significant Russian contribution to the modern movement in art and architecture," end quote, and added that the author had drawn not only from Western collections of Russian art, but also from the far more important collections in Russian museums, which have never been seen in the West. The catalogue essay underlined that, quote, "For the Russian artists, art was an active force in society and not an amusement for the richer classes, and that as a result of the October Revolution from 1917 to 21, they controlled artistic life and thought in Russia," end quote. This concept that the artists of the Russian avant-garde had actual control over the arts in post-revolutionary Soviet culture, which eventually proved to be by and large erroneous, associated a sense of power with the Russian artists, an important issue in the ongoing debates between the various competing tendencies of the New Left, some of whose representatives were not those of them who were not Maoists or followers of Che Guevara's guerrilla warfare and the Latin American movements, chose as model the Bolshevik Revolution. The New Left groups most interested in the Russian avant-garde were the Trotskyist movement, adherents to the legacy of the Paris-based Trotskyist Force International. Such a group was La Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire in Paris, led by Alain Krivine, a split-off of a former French student movement organization, Les Jeunesses Communistes Révolutionnaires. While another political movement of the 1960s, Daniel Cohn-Bendit's March 22 movement, discarded altogether the idea of a political party and organized leadership. La Ligue put original, uncorrupted communism into focus seeking the factors that derailed the original concept of communism that they were convinced had been humanistic and had to be reconsidered as a political alternative in the present. Rereading the history of the early years of Soviet power, they were inspired by Trotsky's idea of a permanent revolution, believing that it was the incessant revolutionary dynamism that could and would prevent bureaucratization, which they thought was the factor that skewed the ideas of October. So the original purity of the revolution, they thought, was clearly demonstrated by the freshness and the sense of freedom of the pre-Stalinist Soviet Russian art, architecture, literature, theater, and film. It appealed to several New Left groups, including the Trotskyists, that early Soviet art was a state-sponsored enterprise, although they knew well that everything was nationalized and state-controlled in post-revolutionary Russia. However, the state's apparent approval of an avant-garde art proved to them that the concepts of a communist state and artistic freedom were not incompatible, and justified their concept of the necessity of a leading political party, a concept that was opposed to the political philosophy of many other movements of the 1960s. In this decade, when abstract art was, with the exception of Poland, banned in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the public presence of it in a communist state back in the 1920s appeared to be the undisputable proof of an original, unlimited freedom that, they claimed, was inherent in communism. Scholarship had not yet revealed the boundaries and supervision that the Bolshevik Party imposed on that art from very early on, indeed. So evidence of such artistic freedom, or such believed artistic freedom, flew in the face of everything that this generation had learned about communism in school. A treasure was discovered that had been hidden by the joint efforts of mainstream politics, both East and West. Since the Trotskyist groups had many activists and members who immigrated from France to France from Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union, some directly from the Warsaw or Prague student movements, or were descendants of former emigres, it is no surprise that they had particular interest in the art and the reenaction of the original revolution. So the parallel between the hopes and historical concepts of the early Soviet avant-garde and the revived hopes of the generation of the 1960s for radical social changes was striking. I quote, "It doesn't need to be proved that understanding the art of the 1920s is indispensable for the understanding of our present world," a Slovakian art critic, Thomas Strauss, wrote in the Catalogue of a Hungarian avant-garde artist. And another quote, "The avant-garde movements of the 1920s cooperated beyond national borders. It is extremely important for us today to understand the trends of our own time through their activity and learning from them to try to overcome our national isolations," end quote. Peter Spielmann wrote this in another Korczak catalog. That is, a new internationalism was also on the agenda of the New Left, or some of its movements, and the model of which was the international avant-garde of the 1920s. And here's an interesting and important fact, and that is that the New Left activists' interest in early Soviet culture coincided with the rapid commercial success of the Soviet Russian avant-garde in the galleries, and with a widespread intellectual curiosity about alternatives of the present conditions since the early 1960s. There was competition, though, for the attention of the public, and actually for the buying public, too. The admiration for the Russian avant-garde was paralleled by the popularity of similar activist tendencies in the West, such as Fluxus, which sought to fuse cultural, social, and political revolutionaries into a united front and action. And the Situationist International, very importantly, discussion of which would go way beyond this present paper, would demand a different conference, that united several formal left-wing groups and was rigorously and passionately anti-capitalist. The Russian constructivism, suprematism, and productivism of the 1920s, as well as the new art that they inspired, resonated as dissident art in the 1960s, both in Eastern Europe and in the West, when the neo-avant-garde, conceptualism, arte povera, and so on, had an oppositional stance directed against the art market and commercialism. Ironically, however, the market played a paradoxically big role in keeping the Russian avant-garde in intellectual vogue, as the revolutionary anti-capitalism of the New Left gave the rubber stamp of approval to the marketing of the Soviet and East European avant-garde art, which reflected the intellectual political engagement of the New Left. So the revolutionary art of the classic avant-garde became one of the staples of the intellectual dissidence of the late 1960s and the 70s. And retrieving this art and keeping it under the public eye, in spite of the East European communist parties that had tried to conceal it, and the mainstream Western culture agents that scorned its leftism, had an aura of moral commitment. So the art dealers now espoused the cause rather than doing mere business, and supported systematic research of the Russian and a few years later East European avant-gardes of the 1920s. And this was due to the cultural discourse initiated by the New Left. And indeed, if you look at the catalogs of the galleries, you can see that they sponsored the research of this art. I'm done. The rediscovery of the Russian avant-garde was a complex experience in the West, which included a sense of repaying a cultural debt and restoring the moral order of European culture, an effort that failed in 1948. An entire generation of artists and intellectuals, a much greater force in the society then than now, felt that they had been wronged, and some remedy had to be done. In his preface to Anatol Kopp's book on the revolutionary Soviet-Russian architects, fellow architect Ian Alshine underlined that one of the book's chief merits was that, I quote, it did not merely rehabilitate Soviet architects, but beyond all politics, it had restored historic truth, which is the condition of further development, end quote. Having remained by and large a cluster of intellectual movements, circles of the New Left have been influential in shaping the gallery scene, the art market, the art discourse, and eventually the museum sphere and scholarship, also bringing about the selective recognition of the avant-garde and post-war art of the East European countries, and thus contributed to remapping the history of modernism. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you everybody for a wonderful 4 days. It's been like an extended, my longest seminar class, but it's kind of like a seminar class that would never, is almost impossible. So thank you also to the Kunst, Haus der Kunst for conceiving this, because I'm sure it wasn't an easy thing to organize either. Oh, yeah. Can you, yeah. Oh, this. In late August 1966, during the incipient stages of the Cultural Revolution in China, students and teachers of the prestigious Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing smashed with axes and shovels the school's plaster cast collection of classical sculptural masterpieces. Used as models from which the school students made sketches as part of their basic training. The plaster casts collection included Michelangelo's David, Venus de Milo, and Apollo Belvedere, as well as Buddhist sculptures from various renowned cave temples in China, with the demonstrative destruction of the plaster cast of what were deemed canonical artworks. The scales of measuring artistic value in the still young communist nation were symbolically and definitively overturned. A month later, the large-scale exhibition of one of the most important sculptural works in Chinese, sorry, I have a code, sculptural works in Chinese modern art history, Wendt Collection Courtyard, opened in Beijing's Forbidden City in the former imperial room for ancestral worship. Wendt Collection Courtyard, a 96-meter-long sculptural installation comprising of 114 life-size clay figures, depicts scenes of downtrodden farmers bringing their harvest as rent to a landlord during pre-communist revolution China. Built and installed in 1965 in an actual courtyard of a former landlord where rent was collected, the sculptures were arranged in 6 tableaus, portraying each stage in the collection of rent. The submission of rent, the inspection of the grain, the measuring of the grain, the settling of accounts, the forcing of rent payment, and the final revote, showing a gathering of a few disgruntled yen mill farmers that you see at the bottom. Soon after its creation in the previous year, Wendt Collection Courtyard was pronounced an official model artwork, and subsequently it inspired similarly grand, life-sized clay sculptural installations nationwide, such as the 300-figured family histories of the Air Force fighters made around 1968, and the 106-figured The Wrath of the Serfs made in 1976. Wendt Collection Courtyard was also completely or partially reproduced and exhibited in many other major cities besides Beijing, and later in allied countries in the 60s, such as Albania and Vietnam, as socialist art from China par excellence. So here's the Albanian catalog for Wendt Collection Courtyard. This is a big undertaking. Actually, maybe I can talk about this more later during the Q&A. Within the Chinese arts world, the arts editor of the party's newspaper, the People's Daily, praised Wendt Collection Courtyard as an, quote, an atomic bomb in the art world, end quote. Well, China also was trying to develop atomic bomb too, so everything was called atomic bomb. That was good. So the only national fine arts journal, Art, also devoted an entire issue to the Wendt Collection Courtyard. The significance of the Wendt Collection Courtyard has often been attributed to its conceptual alignment with ideals of the ruling communist state. Despite the immense communist class rhetoric that came to shroud the Wendt Collection Courtyard, one might still ask, what was the Wendt Collection Courtyard a model for, since it appears an unlikely candidate for such a distinction. According to the 3 prominences rubric used in the assessment of artworks during the extreme radicalism and iconoclasm of China's Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, the time period to which the nearly 3 decades of art under the communist leader Mao Zedong is often conflated with. Art had to, first, portray positive characters, second, emphasize the heroic in the characters, and third, focus on a protagonist among the characters. The Wendt Collection Courtyard, however, fails to satisfy any of these criteria. Instead of optimism, the sculptural group depicts the suffering of farmers, young and old, as they progress from carrying their heavy bags of harvest to the torment under the violent hand of the landlord and his hired men, such as this is tableau 1. There is also no recurring protagonist in the 6th tableau, and the only hint of heroic determination happens where a restless young male peasant strides purposefully forward towards the landlord. However, 2 of the landlord's men restrain him. Even the ending shows only a random grouping of young men, some standing next to each other, while others stand or sit alone. The figures seem pensive, though, then clear and resolute in their next course of action. This failure, rather, indicates that Rent Collection Courtyard achieved its epithet as a model sculpture and an atomic bomb in the art world in 1965, not because it epitomized the official criteria during the Cultural Revolution that started half a year later. Instead, Rent Collection Courtyard's model status belies a larger issue in the arts during that time than its mere function as political propaganda, the issue of what constituted artistic value in the new socialist China. Mao Zedong's call for art to serve the people, made in his famous 1942 speech on art and literature at the communist base in Yan'an before the Communist Revolution, was adopted as the cultural policy of the new People's Republic. Artistic value during the years of Mao Zedong led the communist state, 1949 to 1976, revolved around the concept of, quote unquote, the people, in such terms as in vogue at that time in the arts world, the 3-in-1 combination, sanjiehe, which is a collective work method comprised of a political leader, an artist, and the people collectively making work. There was 高以鲜活, which means making art more intense and typical than even life itself. So in a sense, a type of realism, but it also has a tinge of kind of ink painting. So it's trying to be also Chinese socialist realism. And popularization, or 村中化, or making art that the masses would enjoy. The resounding success of Rent Collection Courtyard lies in how it was able to actively engage with these three concepts of what socialist art was believed to encompass. Rather than illustrating communist notions of art and the social organization of the people through the artwork's content, as was the prevalent artistic strategy employed in response to Mao's call for art to serve the people in the 50s, Rent Collection Courtyard seemingly collapsed the distance between art and life by making art itself a credible means of social mobilization of the people as fellow art collaborators and viewers along with the artists. This paper's analysis of the creation and reception of Rent Collection Courtyard, based on archival research and interviews with the artists who are still alive, as well as visual analysis, will demonstrate the need to reconsider the history of art during the Mao period, more critically besides the predominant narrative, text-driven, or the institutional structures, thank you, and official language for art and culture at the time. The national presses and publications extolled Rent Collection Courtyard's creation and exhibition in the countryside for bringing art, quote, to the people's doorstep, end quote, or the countryside, which was where the majority of the country's population lived, since art was usually at that time created and displayed in the city. What was even more unprecedented than the creation and exhibition of art in the countryside, though, was the unique diversity of the art team who created the sculpture group. The members of the team included a scriptwriter, a photographer, 5 academically trained sculptors from the prestigious art academy in the nearby city, the Sichuan Fine Arts Institute, and the venue's art staff that consisted of a painter, a sculptor, and a folk sculptor. Who usually was made temple sculptures or for Buddhist deities. The installation space of the Rent Collection Courtyard is part of the sprawling countryside estate in remote West China of a former wealthy landlord. Under the local communist government, it was restructured as an exhibition hall and renamed Dayi County's Landlord's Class Education Exhibition Hall. Well, you can kind of guess what that means. Ma Li, the county propaganda chief who oversaw the class education hall and the making of Rent Collection Courtyard, as well as, I should note, a poet himself, emphasized Mao's Yan'an talks by encouraging the art team to learn from each other and, quote, break old frames and foreign frames, end quote, to stage revolution in sculpture. The artists thus followed Mali's exhortation to combine their talents. For example, while the folk sculptor shaped several of the figures' clothing so that it is reminiscent of the flowing treatment of drapery in ancient Buddhist sculpture, and I just put up an example if you're not familiar with that. However, since his sculpted faces also appeared like bodhisattvas or Buddhist deities, one of the art school sculpture professors would revise the faces with a greater attention to anatomy so that it was a quote-unquote modern peasant face. The unique collaboration of folk sculptors and academically trained sculptors, as well as experts in other creative fields such as theater and photography, who are more active in the planning stages of Wendt Collection Courtyard, enabled a new kind of visual art that was lauded by art critics as combining traditional Chinese sculpture with modern sculpture techniques learned earlier in the early 20th century from the French school, and also during the 50s with the Soviet socialist realism. But this was to create a new, distinctly Chinese modern socialist art. Mali also underscored from Mao's Yan'an talks that the artists should learn from the masses. During planning, therefore, the sculptors emphasized how they conducted oral interviews with the local peasants to help construct the sculpture group's content. Farmers, some of who were former tenants of Liu Encai, the landlord, recounted their hardships, described the landlord and his men to the sculptors, and even stood as models for the artist. The artist also left the doors to the courtyard open while they were working, so curious locals would often be able to stop by to see their work in progress and offer them feedback. The media's invariable retelling of how the sculptors learned and sought help from the locals reflect that the value of Wendt Collection Courtyard resides not in the sculpture and its reception alone, but also in the accretion of interactions between the artist and its intended audience. Wendt Collection Courtyard, hence, was commended for realizing the three-in-one combines approach, where authorship lied not solely with one artist or a group of artists, but also with folk artists, as well as the political leader and the local peasant community characterized as the people. Yet the Maoist framework to serve the people, art to serve the people, that Wendt Collection Courtyard was popularly epitomized as diminishes the actual difficulties of this collaborative effort and the intricate details of the hierarchical art world that it had to overcome. For example, when the Art Academy first received the invitation letter from the exhibition hall in the countryside to assist in the making of Wendt Collection Courtyard, some people in the department objected. Arguments stood that the project would simply be making an illustration so that, quote, it is not worth it, end quote. While others remarked that since it was to be made in the base material of clay, it was not making sculpture, but, quote, making models, end quote, so had no artistic value. The prospect of going to the countryside to support class struggle also posed a hindrance to the promising young sculpture professors. One of them, Wang Guanyi, already had 2 works shown in the prestigious National Art Exhibition that occurs every 2 years in Beijing, but he had to turn down the invitation to participate in the next National Art Exhibition in order to accept the assignment of Wendt Collection Courtyard. Additionally, during the actual making of the sculptures, conflicts often arose among the venue's art staff, who had varying amounts of artistic training, and the professional academic sculptors about the best solutions to sculptural problems. Yet in articles and official reports, such instances of conflict are not mentioned, and if they are, politically contextualized, where it's said that after reading and studying Mao's writings, they were able to magically overcome their differences and work in harmony. There's a lot of that if you just open any magazine of China during that time. By portraying the study of Mao's writings as an antidote for their divisiveness in collective work. The conflict that arises in collective work is cast as a problem that is non-existent in socialist art. Thus, the political rhetoric that contextualizes Rent Collection Courtyard either omits the complex issues that counter the official line, or functions to create an ideal discursive idea of a socialist art that, quote, serves the people, such as here with the deliberately harmonious and mobilization depicting collective work. Besides this collective work, Rent Collection Courtyard is also praised for the life-like realism of the figures. To create that art that is, quote, more intense and typical than the life of the people, Rent Collection Courtyard borrowed liberally from theatrical strategies and techniques. Though the medium of sculpture here seems antagonistic to the idea of theater, since it is frozen in time and space rather than animated, the artists strived in their combined efforts to enliven the sculptures. Like how the narrative of a play or opera unfolds over time, the artists explained the progression of emotions they wanted to communicate to the viewers as they traveled through the sculpted sequence, as tears, hatred, and then strength. So they would enter from bottom there, that's the entrance, and they would just follow the arrows, and at the perimeter of the courtyard is Rent Collection Courtyard. A diagram drawn later by one of the artists illustrates, that you see here, illustrates the movement of the visitor into the courtyard, then turning left to circumambulate the opening of the courtyard to view the sculptures in the covered eaves over the courtyard perimeter, and the change in emotions that each tableau is calibrated to elicit. The diagram shows how Rent Collection Courtyard was conceived not just laterally as a series of sculptural tableaus shunted to the perimeter of this courtyard space, but as a magnified tableau encompassing the entire courtyard space that anticipates the viewers as much as the large-scale sculptural installation in the shared space. Furthermore, the 114 figured series of sculptures was designed around 7 main emotional joints, that was what they were called, or main plot points depicting dramatic confrontations between the landlord's villainous henchmen and the peasants. Yet it is in the remaining majority of the figures cast in the space-filling rows or supporting rows as fellow sufferers, bystanders, or spectators to the main scenes in each tableau, where the art team could be more expressive in their investigation into human emotion and form. The cast of supporting figures dwell in liminal space and gestures, poses, and expressions of everyday experience, such as sitting, watching, and waiting. The subtle intensity in the gestures, postures, and glances of these figures appeal to the art world. For example, the leading art critic and National Arts Journal editor, Wang Zhaowen, marveled at the expressive quality of several instances of hands in Rent Collection Courtyard, such as the girl's hands gripping the basket pole and the mother gripping the prison bars. These vignettes scattered about among the 6 tableaux suggest a wider range of psychological trauma and drama in their stillness and ambiguity that the tableau's main actions of conspicuous human conflict that allowed Rent Collection Courtyard to become, as the artists described themselves, more intense and typical than life. Later, however, in 1967, at the height of the Cultural Revolution, Rent Collection Courtyard was accused of, quote, cheating the masses because it was not revolutionary enough. Subsequently, sculptural reproductions of Rent Collection Courtyard were revised to be more visually and emotionally deliberate in conveying the ideological content of class struggle, such as you can see here, raising the head of the old man lying on the ground, as well as changing his facial expression to anger, and raising his hand to point accusingly at the landlord figure. In addition, scenes deemed more revolutionary and heroicizing of the peasants and the Communist Party history of the peasant revolt were appended to the last tableau, so as many as 20 additional figures were added to the original 114. One foreign visitor to the exhibition of reproductions of Rent Collection Courtyard in Beijing commented that in the original installation, the sculptures elicited sympathy and empathy, but in its revised version, the sculptures embodied fury. The artist I interviewed of the original Rent Collection Courtyard said they detested the revisions that distorted the work, but they also did not dare to express their displeasure, especially in the volatile and violent times of the Cultural Revolution. Rent Collection Courtyard, in its many transformed iterations, therefore reflects the contingent nature of art and culture on the ground during the Maoist period, dependent on a confluence of factors, such as the prominence and nature of the artwork project and the shifting political climate. It also suggests that rather than brooding rebels or else naive passive pawns who were forced to serve the political ambitions of the Communist Party, as the artists of Communist China are very many times characterized as. Artists such as those of the Rent Collection Courtyard were not naive or rebels, but were active, yet at sometimes reluctant participants, trying to create a new art that could serve the people. The emotive and sentient life-size sculptures of the original Rent Collection Courtyard activated the courtyard space into a stage in which visitors could perform acts of empathy with or violent acts of retribution on behalf of the sentient sculptures. Besides the visual expressiveness of the sculptures, for the artists as well as the art critics, okay, well, okay, I'll just end it here. Well, I'll just finish this paragraph, then the next one is kind of similar. Well, I was just going to talk about this. So this is a picture of an old lady who visited on the opening day of the Rent Collection Courtyard. And then she is a famous story that's attached with the Rent Collection Courtyard. She apparently tried to hit the henchman in the first tableau. And then it's a really famous story, and I just make the comment that it's that's realism, that kind of, it's not just visual realism, but also the artistic value of being able to activate and emotionally get somebody to react. And then I think that, and then I was just going to show a document. And then there's a film, maybe later if you're interested I can show it to you, but it's just a film that actually stars the Rent Collection Courtyard. So they actually are kind of like talked as of actual people who suffered. So that's also very interesting. A lot of interesting stuff actually happening during this time. And then, and then just, I already knew I was probably going to run out of time, so I cut out stuff about the international circulation of Rent Collection Courtyard. But just to kind of make up for that, if you are interested, this is this is Eero, who I think Min Tianpo you mentioned, or somebody mentioned in their presentation, Eero, and then and he this is in 1974 for Venice Biennale. He made a kind of Mao's last visit to Venice, and so there's it's a whole book of his all the famous propaganda works with just postcards around the world, and he kind of collages them in a painting, and so they're very vivid and kind of very funny. But he's making a critique. So I've been interviewing some artists, especially in Paris, who, I mean, during that time a lot of intellectuals and artists were Maoists, and so just seeing how they responded to Mao or used him in their imagery. And so Eero was just talking with him. He was using it to critique, or kind of critique both systems, capitalism and Maoism. But so we can talk some more in Q&A. Thank you.
Question for Gregor, and thank you very much for the panelists' very interesting presentation. I've been attending this 4-day conference, and I feel like women are still minority within this very global setting. And I would like to ask Gregor, how does figure like artists like Alina Shapochnikov fit into your and I know that I'm aware that you couldn't really have time enough for Poland part, but I'm interested in hearing that, how she fits into that context of realism and abstraction.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Women really, there appear 2 or 3 in that, also in this group forming these exhibitions I mentioned in 55, and I'm not really expert in Alina Shapochnikov at that time. What I know is that she is in contact with all these discussions going on, and also Andrzej Wróblewski is another very important and interesting person who is also part of this Arsenal 1955 group. But as far as I know, at that time, she is not part of this international exhibition. So it's rather Polish. In Poland, she is known, and then the track is a bit lost of her, and then she's rediscovered only in the last 10 years, I would say. So she's not a very important figure in this very period I was talking about. As far as I know, it's yeah.
I can say something about this because Alina was active at the academy that was essentially responsible for that crazy Polish building I showed. She was so the position of women is very interesting because, as you probably know, even basic psychoanalytic texts that feminist critique was founded upon had very limited circulation in Poland, so they had to arrive to feminism from other paths in some ways. But there were so many women active. I mean, first of all, big artist in my representation was a woman, Vera Muchina, and she was considered to be the greatest Soviet artist ever, and ever, So I'm not talking, there's no such thing as gender equality in this region, I can assure you that. But on the other hand, the very rhetoric that men and women are building communism together, which was visible in the sculpture itself, is a very strong one. And for that respect, there's so many women, many more women are participating in the scene that I described, both pre and post Stalinism, than they are, say, in many Western countries at the time. But this is the 50s, don't expect too much.
I have a comment rather than a question, and that has to do with the Rent Collection Courtyard. In the sense that growing up in Nigeria as an art student, I was studying the Rent Collection Courtyard as a basis for learning realistic figuration. And this was a big deal in the art department, the catalog. I didn't know how I got there, but this was one of our reference points. And then in the early 2000s, there's this Nigerian sculptor, Sunday Jack Appan, who is often presented as, one of these non-literate artists that's been promoted by Jean Pigozzi, the Swiss collector. And I did an interview with him. At that time, he was making these heroic military sculptures that were being commissioned by the military governments in southeastern Nigeria. And he was prized for his realism. Now, I had this interview with him, and he started talking about the Rent Collection Courtyard. Apparently, he had found a catalog again. He didn't remember how he got it, but he said to me that the loss of that catalog was one of the biggest tragedies of his career, because apparently one of his apprentices stole the catalog. So just to say that piece of work had a life of its own that was way beyond, communist China.
Thank you so much for that comment, and it's this is the first time I heard in Nigeria. It also made an impact. I know that the catalog was translated in 8 languages, even Esperanto. I don't know where that was going, but but it's I would be interested to talk with you more. And I even met like different people when I been up Rent Collection Courtyard, like this bookseller. He told me his cousin saw it and started making clay. I mean, something about it makes you want to just start making. And also, I found out the Avatar, the person who made Avatar, the movie, he also said that he started working or modeling and making art with Collection Courtyard. So that's that was, I mean, when he was little. So it's it has a really big field of influence.
Vivian, this is Alexandra. I also want to just make a comment about Rent Collection Courtyard, which I think is especially relevant for this group, which is, of course, Harold Zeman became aware of it in the early 1970s and had always wanted to stage it in one of his many exhibitions and had tried unsuccessfully to actually bring one of the copies, I think there were as many as 100, to one of his exhibitions. I can't remember which one, but he finally was able to realize it in his last Venice Biennale of 1999, when, of course, he invited Tsai Gok-chang, and in collaboration with Tsai, restaged it with many of the living artists, including Wang Guangyi. And it was staged, as some of you might remember, in the Arsenale, with the very radical intervention that the sculptures were allowed to disintegrate. They were made in wet clay on these wooden armatures in very classical style that had originally been used in the Sichuan version, but over the course of the exhibition, they all sort of disintegrated. And when the Guggenheim, when we mounted the Tsai Gok-chang retrospective in 2008, I really desperately wanted this work. It was very controversial because, of course, the Chinese officialdom didn't want to cede authority or even, in fact, Tsai was, as many of you know, actually there were lawsuits against him for appropriating this copyright. But Tsai also did this kind of brilliant postmodernist intervention and said, well, appropriation is what art is all about these days. And we staged it at the Guggenheim, and these guys came and redid it, and they also disintegrated. So I think this afterlife of the Rent Collection Courtyard, whether it's in Nigeria or in the ramps of the Guggenheim, is also very, very powerful, and the continuing power that it holds, conceptual and formal, on the imagination of the world.
I'll just thank you so much for the wonderful comment. Actually, Schimann, or sorry, my, but the Harold Schimann, he's it was 1972 document of 5 that he wanted to include this in. And so actually this summer I'm going to the Getty Library where they have his archive. And now they finally I've been waiting. They just got it maybe 3 years ago, and ever since then I've been asking them when is it open, when are those collections, that archive open, and it just opened this year. So I'm looking forward to finding out more about his fascination with Collection Courtyard too. But thank you for your comment.
I thought there was a bit of interesting conjunction between Gregor's beginning with the North Korean studio, factory, art factory, sculpture factory, and the Rent Collection Courtyard model. do you know if there is any kind of a reference? Well, this predates the rent collection, the production of rent collection, because the studio was created in 1959. But it's very interesting because these kinds of socialist realist sculptures are, in fact, incredibly ubiquitous in Africa, in Ethiopia, in Zimbabwe. The one you showed in Senegal. Africa is a very, very important source of commissions for some of these studios. Is there a similar thing in China, a kind of, related type of, sculpture factory for exports, in the art collection, rent collection, courtyard sculpture model to elsewhere?
Do you mean like factories making rent collection courtyards to export out?
Yeah, those kind of, that model, not necessarily the exact replication of a rent collection courtyard. But I'm very interested in this, this interesting parallel with the images that you showed, Gregor, of Frankfurt, Dakar, I think somewhere else, or both places. Yes.
What I know is that Mansuda has a big like a gallery also in Beijing, in the gallery district. So I don't know if there is a Chinese, also a Chinese company doing this, but Mansuda is very present in Beijing. So you can go there even. I even talked to people who went there and saw the art. You can buy it, and so yeah, this is what I know. It's kind of a showroom, yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
And I just wanted to add that Mansuda studio I went to in Beijing is right across from Pace in 798. Just to give you the idea, it is a showroom. They make it to look like a gallery, and so it's kind of weird. But and then in Beijing, I have asked. I mean, actually, it was because I found out about Mansuda studio that I came across an article about it, about that Frankfurt or the European Commission, and then so then I started asking sculptors in China, since I was still there at the time. Was there international export like factories, sculpture factories? So there were sculpture factories, but I don't know if they were so organized as Mansuda. One sculptor, he worked in the Beijing, in every big city had a sculpture factory, and he said they did do some for Africa, he remembered. So I don't know how compared to North Korea's sculpture factory, I don't know how they compare. I just asked casually, but some did exist. I don't know how active they were, but they did export.